Dr. Naresh Cuntoor. He is a senior research scientist, Intelligent Automation Inc., Rockville, MD, US. He has an MS and PhD from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, University of Maryland. His research interests include human activity recognition, scene understanding, perceptual organization, and computer vision for robotics applications. He pursues Sanskrit with keen interest and is a volunteer for Samskrita Bharati, USA.
I'll focus on these two aspects of Pollock's view on Rasa theory. The first being the change-based perspective, and the second being his take on the science and history of Rasa development and how it has a potential connection to modern thought and perceptual aesthetics and cognitive theories, even though Pollock doesn't think that link can be made. One of the first things that he talks about in his work on Rasa theory is that Pollock believes that these two forms of literature, the Drishya Kavya and Shravya Kavya, are fundamentally distinct entities. And he makes this argument in a set of 5 steps. So the first thing that he says is that Sanskrit texts themselves recognize the difference between these two literary forms, the literature heard and the literature seen forms. There isn't too much to say about that, except to say that yes, Drishya Kavyas and Shravya Kavyas are treated as different forms of literary expression. But the more interesting claim that Pollock makes is that these two forms of literature are fundamentally different. So naturally the question becomes, what is this nature of difference and what does that imply? We'll come back to what does it imply in the next slide. But how does he support this claim is essentially through 3 arguments. So he offers Bhoja's characterization of poets and poetry as opposed to actors and acting, using a couple of introductory comments that Bhoja makes in his Sringara Prakasha. So there, Bhoja, he does say that he considers poets and poems or kavya to be more praiseworthy than actors and acting. But I think it's crucial to see the context within which Bhoja makes this point. So he is stating this as a claim to prove that he considers things that are visible as being slightly less value-laden than things that go beyond just what the visible form presents. And Bhoja then sort of goes on to make the point of how Shabdartha, meaning the word and meaning, by itself, does not convey what a Sahitya conveys. So Sahitya, in that sense, has a much broader scope in its ability to reflect subtle and complex thoughts than simple words and their meanings. So Sahitya stuff brings about the relationship between word and meaning and goes beyond. So Bhoja makes a similar point about poets and poetry, comparing them to actors and acting. So the poets and poetry has a lot more subtle and rich interpretation that a reader can perceive. So in that context, Bhoja makes this point. Okay. The second argument that Pollock raises here is a verse that is not attributed to anybody in particular. It's an anonymous verse, which clearly states that literature in the word form or the Shravya Kavya is more praiseworthy because it has a higher narrative power. And the word that the verse uses is Vastu Shakti Mahima, which is true. One can express much more complex and subtle thoughts in word, which on stage might not be easily depicted. And finally, Pollock raises the thing about Abhinavagupta, where he says, Abhinavagupta in his commentary on Natya Shastra praises actors over poets. So he takes sort of an opposite viewpoint to Poja, essentially. But the crucial point there is that Abhinavagupta is writing a commentary on Natya Shastra, and naturally he would be inclined to praise actors because the whole point of his commentary is to talk about drama. And so one doesn't really understand why that would be so shocking of Abhinavagupta in Natya Shastra's commentary. Be that as it may, so these three aspects are really the evidence that Pollock provides to say that these two forms of literature are fundamentally different. So the question for somebody who would then, a traditional scholar who would then be able to refute this is to say to what extent are these claims valid and what are the counter views that one can put forward. I'm not going to attempt that exercise here, but just to make the point that I think these three claims are the core claims of his, the first point, a fundamental difference in the two forms of literature. If we accept this claim to begin with, that is to say that if we accept that literature heard and literature seen are fundamentally different, the implication that Paula gives us is that the way Rasa is treated, the Natya Rasa and Kavya Rasa, should also be very different. And in particular, there should have been a significant evolution of Rasa from Natya to Kavya. And that is what Pollock wants to look for. So that is the narrative he wants to build up. One, to say that there is a fundamental difference between these two forms. Then to posit that there must be an accompanying development of Rasa theory. And then to sort of establish a development that fits this narrative. So that is the framework within which this change-based perspective is being developed. And then he makes the point that Rasa must have expanded in scope in many ways. So these are the kinds of examples that he provides to say how Rasa would have expanded in scope, or Rasa theory would have expanded in scope to accommodate more subtle forms of literary expression in the written form of literature. I say written form of literature, but it's really the Shravya Kavya, which is not the non-drama, let us say. So I won't get into the details of these points for want of time, but simply to mention that Pollock calls out the differences in the number of rasas and the different frameworks within which rasa theory has been developed in traditional thought, including Mimamsa, Vedanta, and Bhakti, and so on. And interestingly enough, he calls out a special role for Buddhism in the development of rasa theory. Specifically, he claims that the notion of Karuna rasa would have been alien to these pre-Buddhist Hindu poets, because the notion of ahimsa and karuna and all of that was really a contribution that is uniquely tied to Buddhists and not to the Brahminical poets. And here he takes the view of Samuel Johnson. He quotes this pity is not natural to man, which is a Samuel Johnson's quote, to say that compassion or pity or karuna is not something that is naturally developed in man. It's something that one civilizationally develops, as the Buddhists did, and by implication Hindus did not. So Hindus imported this notion from the Buddhists in developing the notion of karuna rasa. But of course, Pollock leaves out the subsequent part of Samuel Johnson's quote that I mentioned here. The pity is not natural to man. Children are always cruel. Savages are always cruel. So Samuel Johnson is making this point in a civilization versus colonialism, that kind of a context. But we'll leave that apart for now. And I'll come back to this. Pity is not natural to man in a couple of slides. But now, to another form of change that Pollock mentions here, he really hails the contribution of Udbhata. Pollock says that before the advent of Udbhata, Rasa theory was riddled with a whole lot of confusion and contradictions, and then says that Udbhata really changed the picture and clarified the picture. And what is the evidence that he provides, Pollock provides? So he points to how Rasa was treated by the three Udbhata theorists, in particular Bharata, Bhamaha, and Dandi. So Bharata's position on Rasa is that Rasa arises from the conjunction of factors, reactions, and so on. This is a very familiar position that we heard in the previous talk as well, so I won't delve into that. And Bhamaha does not really treat Rasa as a separate topic, and this is Pollock observes this as well. And Dandi, he notes, does not provide a special treatment of Rasa, but then he really uses the same formula that Bharata used for Rasas. So it's hard to make out, from my perspective, what the contradiction between these three theorists are. So Bharata laid out the foundational principle, Bhamaha did not have anything new to say about it, and Dandi essentially refers back to Bharata. So what is contradictory in this position is not clear. But Pollock claims that there were these contradictions which Udbhata resolved. So I think it would be interesting for us to see whether Udbhata's contribution is indeed path-breaking. So what kind of contradictions were existing, if they were existing, and what did Udbhata do? I don't have an answer to this question. I leave this as a question to more knowledgeable people. But I think this is a form of change that Pollock specifically calls out, and it would be interesting to see what the traditional position on this question would be. In the previous talk, as we heard, Pollock is supposed to have mentioned that Rasa belongs to the actor. I actually don't think that Pollock says that. So Pollock describes the position of Rasa localization as described by various theorists over time. And Pollock calls out the contribution of Sri Shankuka and Bhattanayaka for having made this unique observation that Rasa really belongs to the spectator and not to the actor. In fact, Pollock goes into some length to describe Bhattanayaka's view of how the spectator would then perceive the Rasa that is depicted. And the depiction does not have to be just in a dramatic sense, where actors are acting out a play or something of that sort. It could just as well apply to the case where a reader is savoring a work of poetry by himself. To Rajivji's question about whether somebody can by themselves experience the rasa without a third party acting out that for them. Indeed, yes, one can do that. And Bhattanayaka and Shankuka really make the case for how that process would occur. So how would a spectator or a reader perceive the rasa in the work of art by experiencing it? And here Bhattanayaka's formulation of Sadharani Karana is something that Pollock actually praises. I won't go into the details of it for want of time, but what Pollock is doing is actually tracing the evolution of rasa localization from being in the actor to being in, from being in the work to the actor to the spectator. And then at each point, addressing the questions that need to be addressed. So if it is in the spectator, how does every spectator understand it, and so on. I'll only say here that this is a point that even traditional discussions have a lot to say about, meaning people keep coming back to this question of where the Rasa is located. But to some extent, it seems a little overblown in my opinion, because even going back to Natya Shastra, the importance of audience is clearly recognized. Bharata discusses different types of spectators and different types of audience, and he says that for this type of audience, these types of plays won't really be suitable because it will simply go over their heads. I mean, they won't be able to appreciate the nuances. So clearly, Bharata takes the view that spectators is quite central to what is being enacted. And similarly, Shankuka gives the example of Rasa in a painting, essentially. So he describes the painted horse and says what all kinds of emotions can be evoked in somebody looking at the painted horse. So I think this has a long history, even if it is not explicitly called out as Rasa localization. So here, Pollock has several criticisms of why certain stable emotions came to be called as stable emotions, sthayi bhavas. For example, he says, why should anger be considered as a sthayi bhava and hatred is not? Why should rati become a stable emotion but not sneha? And these are, I think, valid questions to ask. And Pollock does call out the argument of Dhananjaya and Abhinavagupta, but he doesn't really accept their arguments. And I think this is a discussion that's worth having, and to see whether Pollock has a point here or whether there is a counter view that really should prevail. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I will leave that to more knowledgeable people again. And another criticism that he makes is that the list of emotions seems to be quite stable in Indian literature, unlike Western aesthetic thought where emotions sort of come up. Melancholy was a newer emotion that was introduced, and so on. So Pollock finds this hard to digest. Why should some emotions not evolve with time? And that's actually a fair question to ask. I think there are a lot of ideas in today's understanding of psychophysics and cognitive sciences which would apply to Rasa theory. In particular, these kinds of ideas that I call out here would, I think, merit some serious investigation into seeing how we can understand Rasa. The idea here is not to look for modern scientific notions in ancient texts. Rather, I think the question is whether we can interpret Rasa theory as it is in newer frameworks. This is an exercise that is not alien to the Rasa tradition. As we have seen, Rasa tradition has used Mimamsa framework at some point, then it used Vedanta framework, then it used Bhakti framework, and so on. So can we similarly use a modern scientific framework to understand what Rasa is and where is it localized and so on? How do emotions arise and what kinds of emotions persist? What kinds of emotions are temporary? And all those questions can be addressed. So multiple memory systems are a fairly well-established notion both in cognitive science and computational science, where we recognize the difference between long-term memory and short-term memory. So the question then becomes, how does a poet employ various devices to invoke different aspects of long-term memory and short-term memory to give the reader a feel of the emotion that he intends to convey? Another theory, I'm rapidly going over this for want of time. Another theory is Gestalt's loss of perception. This is a visual theory which tries to explain how we as humans are able to perceive objects just by a set of few points or lines. So our visual system can complete objects, complete lines, and form beautiful pictures, even if what we have actually observed are very few points. And there are several principles that come into play. So what are the analogs from Rasa theory that we can bring out to see how giving a few indicators in word, the poet is able to convey a sense of a whole, which is much more than a sum of just individual parts. Another theory is reductionism, which is prevalent both in art and in math. Reductionism is where you take a complex idea, break it down into a set of simple problems, and then you look at the simple problems. In art, reductionism evolved, for example, in the case of modern art. So people first asked the question, okay, we want to paint landscapes. Then came the era of impressionism, right? So where you don't paint the entire details of the landscape, but sketch out the essential elements and leave the rest to the viewer's imagination. Then it came up to, well, why should you give a picture like that? What are the elements of drawing? Lines, shapes. So can we let the viewer make up whatever he wants to infer by just those primitive shapes and lines? That's modern art. So these kinds of reductionist techniques have been used both for analysis and for application. So Rasa theory, what does it have to say about this? And finally, the case of mirror neurons has really revolutionized our understanding of empathy and compassion and pity. So this old adage of pity is not natural to man is not a contemporary notion at all. So we understand this much more differently now. So what does that impact our understanding of Rasa theory? So these are the kinds of questions I think merit serious consideration. So in closing, I'd say that Pollock understands Rasa theory quite well, and he has a particular, let us say, endeavor to say that Rasa theory as it exists today and the history and its science is quite murky, which needs to be clarified, and that's where somebody like Pollock would step in and clarify the whole field of Rasa theory for us. So that's really the enterprise that he is building up. If there is something that he is bringing to the table that is worthy of consideration, we should certainly look at it, I think, and not summarily dismiss his understanding, but also call out his ideas which are not either well-formed or just incorrect. And it would also be interesting to see why he invokes Utpata and Bhattanayaka repeatedly, and if it's something that traditional schools also consider equally important. If not, why not? And as I said, this science of Rasa is indeed very topical, and we should pursue that. And that's something that Pollock's writings really lack. He doesn't really seem to have fully formed ideas of how science of Rasa should be formulated. And he tends to look at Rasa in a very isolated manner and without taking in the larger cultural context or the context of Auchitya, which is a fairly important concept in traditional thought. So these are the kinds of ideas I think are worthy for further consideration. I'll stop here and hopefully take questions if I can hear them.
Okay, wonderful, great presentation. In my reading of Pollock, he says that in a simplified way, if I can characterize it, he says that the spiritual dimension was lacking until recent centuries. Rupa Goswami and that kind of an era is when spirituality gets introduced, almost like it's a very modern kind of a thing, but he's really trying to develop a rasa aesthetics, which is not where the sacredness isn't as important. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, in fact, that's something that I found strange in Pollock's view, because he clearly knows that there has been this Vedanta aspect of rasa, which is in fact today's dominant framework for looking at rasa theory. For example, if somebody like Kutumba Shastri ji were to give a talk on rasa theory, he would use the framework of rasa theory to explain, Advaita to explain rasa to us.
Yeah.
And that is well known. And Pollock, in fact, mentions this in the Reader book. He very briefly mentions this, but then very quickly switches track to Bhakti tradition and then goes on to Rupa Goswami and the like.
Right. So a few things. First, it's a common practice of Pollock to acknowledge something just to make sure he won't be criticized for ignoring it. He acknowledges something and then suddenly ignores it completely in his final conclusions. In other words, there's a disconnect between what he has acknowledged and he hasn't disposed of it in any conscious way. He just acknowledges it, and in the next section, it's like it never existed, and he moves on as if ignoring it. This is one thing. Now, regarding your comment, you find it strange that he does not want to consider the sacred dimension. It is not strange because you see, you've looked at the rasa idea, the rasa work of Pollock in isolation. He does not connect all his works very explicitly for readers like us. He connects them in his classrooms for his students, but he has a grand narrative. And in that grand narrative, it is basically the desacralization, which is one of the topics we put into this conference. Removing the sacred is a very major underlying, agenda. So where it is sacred, that was the whole idea of separating the Paramarthika from the Vyavaharika. That was also the idea of Shastras being linked with Vedas are problematic. They deny freedom and so on, and they cause human rights problems. That is also, the sacred element is also a problem in the Ramayana when Ramayana encourages the divine king, and the divine king, in human beings is oppressive. So if you look at, it's a very, why I consider him to be so important is that unlike those who dismiss the Sanskrit tradition, those leftists and Marxists who dismiss the Sanskrit tradition, he actually thinks it's very important to study it, understand it, and reinterpret it as a tradition where the sacredness was linked with kind of social problems, and the beautiful things like kavya and aesthetics, which have to be recovered and rescued, have to be removed. You have to get rid of the sacred element in order to rescue them. This is why in his work he's so clear that Shastra and kavya have to be separated. The one is a problem, the other is wonderful and beautiful. So in order to do this, he has to eliminate the sacred element from rasa. So maybe you could look into that as a possible way of understanding him further.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, what you say certainly makes sense. And in fact, looking at it from that perspective, it also makes sense why he would, for example, give a special emphasis to Buddhism here and say that Buddhists had to teach these Brahmanical priests to learn compassion.
Yeah.
So that sort of ties into,
and all the texts that he wants to valorize are post-Buddhism. Writing is after Buddhism, kavya is after Buddhism. Before Buddhism was oral, it was only Paramarthika, it was oppressive, it was exclusivist, and things like that. So the social, political underlying framework one should understand. It is very, very difficult you have to read him all his books and here and there and put it together, and then when you get his framework, then you go back and read it a second time and it makes more sense.
I think that's true. Yeah. And in fact, even looking at Death of Sanskrit and this, the Language of God's book and this, they have a similar thread running through them, with making a distinction between the oral tradition and the written tradition that has a very significant parallel here. So I guess that's something that traditional scholars should be able to easily refute, but then do that in a principled manner. But I agree with your point that looking at his works the second time, having read all the books, gives you a very different understanding of where he is coming from and what narrative he is really constructing. Because at the end of the day, in most of his works, it seems to be about narrative building. So you have a sort of a top-down approach where you have decided your narrative, and then you sort of find a verse here, a quote there, to make up that narrative. And even if it doesn't really make up the complete narrative, it doesn't matter because you have already given your conclusion. And that's what in his works become important. And if, for example, as I try to bring out here, he makes this claim of this fundamental difference between these two forms of literature. But the evidence that is provided is really flimsy. But then the conclusion is already stated, and there ends the matter.
I would just like to point out a couple of things. Pollock puts a lot of emphasis on chronology, as Rajiv ji has already pointed out in on various occasions, that chronology is one of the tools by which he shows that there are discontinuities. And also in Rasa theory, for example, from Rasa Sin to Rasa Hard, one of the articles that Professor Pollock has published, he tries to show that the domain of Natya, domain of the scene, is the domain from where the Rasa analysis has been borrowed and extended to the domain of the Kavya. But as a Bengali musician, I am reminded of a text, a 16th century text on music and dance. It's called Sangeeta Damodara. It's written by Pandit Shubhankar in 16th century, where he is talking about nritta, dance and music, vocal music. And in this, there are discussions of mudras, and obviously nritta is not just for the ear, it is also for the visible art. It is a drishyam. So in that also he borrows the Saridaya Hridaya Samvadi from the Sahitya Darpana and also Abhinavagupta, and also he invokes the Brahma Swada Sahodara concept. So I think that is also important to dismiss the kind of discontinuity that Professor Pollock tries to show.
To help me, you can do two things. You can go to the subscribe button on my YouTube and subscribe. We need more subscribers there. Secondly, I get lots of emails on people saying, how do we donate? How can we help you? You go to rajivmalhotra.com or you go to infinityfoundation.com and you can hit the donate button. You can donate in dollars. There are different ways mentioned. If you want to donate in rupees, there is a column called Infinity Foundation India, and you click that and there are instructions on how you can donate in India.